Hey guys, welcome back to Builds by Maz. Today I'll be showing you how you can pour a simple concrete pad like this, even if it's your first time using concrete. We removed these old pavers leading up to our shed and replaced it with this nice concrete walkway, which looks so much better and is a lot more functional. Follow along and I'll walk you through all the steps so you can do the same thing. Let's get started. The first thing you need to do is determine the dimensions for your concrete pad. I'm just going to replicate the same size as this pad that's already in place. Then I went ahead and dug out all these old pavers, as well as these big rocks. These pavers weren't even all the same size and they were just kind of placed haphazardly, so it was a really bad look in front of the shed. Now whether or not you've got pavers or something else to remove yourself, you're going to want to remove the top layer of grass. You generally don't want to pour concrete directly over any organic living material. That's because once you pour the concrete, the grass will decay over time and can leave voids underneath, which may cause some settling in your concrete pad. Now I need my new concrete to be level with the existing pad, so I'm digging a few inches into the ground. You generally want a minimum of a 4-inch thick concrete pour to ensure that it's stable and structurally sound. If your concrete pad's going to be above ground, you won't need to dig this deep, but just make sure it's still 4 inches thick. Either way, make sure your subsurface is flat and compact. If you have loose soil, you'll need to tamp it down until it's firm. Once you've got your subsurface prepared, you can go ahead and cut the frame to size. I'm using 2x4s. You want to make sure you use at least 2-inch thick wood, otherwise the weight of the concrete can cause it to bow. This is a great time to use some scrap wood, and even if you have big imperfections like this, you can just turn it to the outside. It's no big deal. As long as the inner edges are okay and the wood is straight, then you should be fine. When you're sizing out your frame, make sure that you're measuring from the inside edges of the 2x4s, because that's as far as the concrete will go. If you have a standalone slab, you can do all 4 sides with 2x4s, but you'll see I'm only doing these 3 sides here, and for the last side, I'm going to use what's called an expansion joint. This is only 1/2 inch thick, and they're made to go in between pieces of concrete. It's going to fit in place right here, and the concrete will support it from bowing. I'm using this because I don't want a big space between these concrete pads. But it cuts just like wood, and you can attach it to the frame with screws. Even though it's a little wider than these 2x4s, the important thing is that this top edge is flush, because that'll be important in leveling out the concrete surface. Once I had everything in place, I used some white spray paint and marked off where the edges of the concrete frame were going. I dug a small trench all along the border, and what this is going to do is allow the edges to sit a little bit lower than the rest of the pad, which is going to help prevent water from getting underneath it and will also reduce the chance that the pad shifts in place. Next, you'll want to use some of these stakes all around the outer edge of your frame to make sure that it doesn't move at all when you pour the concrete. The concrete's going to be really heavy, and if you don't use enough of these, your wood may bow a little bit or the whole thing could shift. With everything staked down, you'll want to check for any gaps underneath your frame where concrete may want to run out. I'm just going to fill this in with some excess dirt to make sure that it's a tight seal. Also, throughout this whole process, make sure you're continuously checking that your frame is level and in line with where you want it to be. I did that after every step, but just forgot to film it. Before pouring the concrete, you're going to want to use a layer of gravel or other aggregate. This is going to provide a more stable base than just dirt alone, and I used a thin layer of these pea pebbles. This is a really small slab, and it's going to be for foot traffic only, so I really don't need any rebar or other internal reinforcement. If you're pouring a larger slab, or it's going to be under heavier load from vehicles or something, you'll want to use rebar spaced both vertically and horizontally to help prevent cracking. I threw this in just because I had an extra spare piece, and it doesn't hurt. Another option is to use concrete wire mesh. It normally comes in a grid pattern, but I had these strands from a previous project. Again, I went ahead and threw these in just because I had them. Really don't need them for a project this small, but this is an easier option than using rebar. Concrete needs to remain wet for a long time in order to cure properly, so we're going to aid that process by watering down our gravel underneath the pour. This is important because otherwise the ground can absorb too much moisture from the wet concrete, causing it to dry out prematurely. For mixing the concrete, I like using these mixing tubs. They're shallow and have curved edges, making it super easy. The easiest way to open these bags is to cut them through the middle, flip them over, and lift up to empty out the dry concrete. These tubs are a good size for holding 2 80-pound bags at a time. I wouldn't do more than that, especially when you're first starting out, because it can be difficult to mix. I think using a garden hoe is the best tool for mixing up the concrete. It really makes the process simple. There's not really a set formula for how much water to add, and it can be dependent on your environment. You definitely don't want to have any dry powder like you see right here, so make sure that's all mixed in properly, and then just add water a little bit at a time until you get a consistency similar to this. It's kind of like a slush that feels very workable. It'll take some trial and error, but eventually you'll get the hang of it. We poured this first batch into the mold, and then my wife started spreading it around while I began mixing another couple bags of concrete. We just repeated this same process a couple more times, mixing 2 bags at a time and filling up the mold. Once it was almost filled to the top, I mixed one last bag of concrete and shoveled it in until we could start leveling it off. For this step, you need a long and straight 2x4, and you'll just rest it against opposite ends of the frame and shimmy it back and forth, slowly pushing along the excess concrete, leaving behind a smooth surface. It won't be perfect on the first run, but don't worry about rushing. You've got plenty of time before the concrete cures, and you can always fill in some low spots. It's helpful to have a trowel handy for this step to work out these imperfections as you work the 2x4 down the slab. Also, you can make things easy on yourself by cutting down the stakes to be the same height as the edge of the frame, so you can work this 2x4 easily with nothing getting in the way. But they're pretty easy to work around, which is what we did here. After the final pass with the 2x4, we used some wet trowels to smooth out the surface. Keeping things wet makes the concrete a lot easier to work with and can give you a really polished look. Here's how the concrete pad looked when we began to let it dry. It's not completely perfect, but we'll fix it up once the concrete is semi-dry. After about 45 minutes, I used this concrete edger all along the border of the concrete to give it some rounded edges. The concrete will have firmed up a little bit by this point, but all you need to do is rock the tool back and forth, putting one edge in at a time until it starts to smooth out, and then you can run it easily all along the edge. Obviously, you can skip this step if you want really sharp 90-degree edges, but this just gives you a little bit of a softer look, but it's up to you. This is also a time when you can continue to smooth out the surface of the pad. Make sure you're keeping the trowel wet, or you can sprinkle some water right on top of the concrete, but keeping it wet really makes it a lot easier to work with. You can see how smooth it is after this second round of touch-ups, and if you want a smooth surface, you can leave it like this. I wanted to add a little texture though, so after about another hour and a half of drying, I used this concrete broom and very lightly brushed it back and forth along the surface. This will create little grooves which will help with slip resistance if the pad gets wet or icy. After about 12 hours, I could go ahead and remove the stakes and the form. But don't make the mistake of just leaving the concrete out to dry. This next step is really important. You need to constantly water the concrete to keep it wet every few hours for the next couple of days. If the concrete dries out too quickly, it'll be prone to cracks or breaks. Keeping it watered down improves the curing process and will make for a stronger concrete. I also went ahead and cleaned off this existing concrete slab. It really doesn't have anything to do with the new concrete, but it's always satisfying to watch things getting pressure washed, so please enjoy. With everything looking nice and clean, I went ahead and installed a new expansion joint in between these concrete slabs, and I knew it would fit perfectly since I used one of these for the mold. I then used some topsoil around the edges so that the concrete pad would look flush with the ground. After some light sweeping to get rid of some surface dirt, this new shed walkway was totally done. The great part about working with concrete is you can get projects done really quickly, and this whole thing only took us a few hours from start to finish. If you're a first-time concrete DIYer, I hope this video gave you some good tips and made the whole thing seem less intimidating. Make sure to subscribe to catch the next project, and we'll see you next time.